International and Comparative Law. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Robert Jervis. This talk today is part of a series of presentations that the International and Comparative Law Center is offering throughout the year. I encourage everyone to check the website for the International Law Center to see the series of speakers coming up, many of them presenting interesting books like the one today. And we have, in fact, a talk scheduled for next week. Our speaker today, Dr. Jervis, is the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Politics at Columbia University. Before joining the Columbia faculty, he held faculty appointments at Harvard and UCLA. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, as well as the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has also served as the president of the American Political Science Association. He is the author of numerous books and other publications, and today he will be talking with us about his most recent book. It's called Why Intelligence Fails, Lessons from the Iranian Revolution and the Iraq War. Dr. Jervis will speak for maybe about 45 minutes or so, and that will leave around 15 minutes or so for questions from you, and then we'll have a book signing on the third floor in the loggia after the conclusion of the talk. So welcome, Dr. Jervis.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also a great pleasure to talk at a law school because it's always so much better appointed than the social science buildings I'm used to being in. As you've learned from the introduction, the book that I'm talking is built on two case studies I did for the government, one of both intelligence failures, one the failure to see the Shah of Iran might fall over 30 years ago, and the second, the more recent Iraq WMD failure. And I'm going to talk both in general and then on the Iraq WMD, and then another case, although I'm perfectly happy to talk about questions on the Iranian case as well. Let me give you the introduction and then move through it. The first, I want to talk a bit about postmortems, that is the studies that I did and others have done, and some both problems with them generically. Then second, I want to talk about the topic of politicization of intelligence, which comes up especially sharply in the Iraq WMD case. Some of you read the New York Review of Books. You may have seen the exchange between myself and Tom Powers, who reviewed my book on this subject. And whenever I give these talks or go in a debate, as I'm going to next week, and this is the topic everyone focuses on, so I do want to take some time to talk about it, although I don't think it's where the action is in this case. Then I want to turn to other aspects of the Iraq case, and without, I hope, giving away all the punchlines of my book, to talk about the root causes of the failure. Then I want to talk about another case that isn't in the book, the famous or infamous NIE, National Intelligence Estimate, on Iran's nuclear program in the fall of 2007, and then a few conclusions. So it's going to be a sort of a forced march through a lot of that. All right, let me talk a bit about postmortems, some just basic points. First, they're hard to do, actually. I've done now two of them, and I've read a lot more. A lot of research involved, but mostly it's hard figuring out exactly what happened. The more recent you get, the harder it is to get all the material because more of it is going by email or telephone calls, and the latter don't leave any trace in the records. And meetings that may be important, you don't often have the records you want. And if you do it supplement the reading with the interviews, which I did in these two cases, people first may not have incentives to tell you the full story, and most importantly, their memories aren't great, even of recent things. These events they're trying to dredge their memories are cases where they're under tremendous pressure. Events are coming thick and fast. it's extraordinarily difficult for people to remember what they thought at particular times, so they're not easy to do. There's a generic problem, and it comes up in a lot of the discussion of the Iraq WMD, and that is it's extremely difficult to avoid having your views polluted by hindsight. You know what is true, and with some quotes around true, for there are a lot you don't know. And so it's very hard to stop yourself from importing back into the study what you now know to be the case. And say if there's an argument about, well, is this country, is there going to be a revolution or not? And when you're reading the discussion and, if you know there wasn't a revolution, well, it's very hard to fairly judge that argument because, it comes out. I think, and some people think I didn't escape that problem in the Iran case. I think I was pretty careful, but it's extraordinarily difficult. Another problem of learning any lessons is we almost always do, we almost never do postmortems on successes. That's important because if we want to know causation, you have to compare failures and successes. It's almost never done. Several of us have urged the intelligence community to do that. A little progress, not a lot. Another problem with postmortems is they're often done with the hope and really the expectation of finding the silver bullet. We're going to find out what was wrong, we're going to fix it, and we're not going to make mistakes again. Forget it. It's never going to happen that way. Come in with that attitude, you're just going to produce a bad study. And most of the postmortems the government has done, and I've read a great many of them, are not particularly good, partly for that reason. The final general problem is politics. Now, I'm a professor of political science. I've never fully engaged in politics, but I like it. I don't regard it as dirty business, all the rest. So when I say that politics is involved, it's a little, I'm shocked to find politics in this area. The postmortems on Iraq have that problem, especially the so-called SISI, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which produced a report yay thick. And if you're really interested in the case, it's great because it's having a dull research assistant. It was done, I'm afraid, can I say it, by lawyers. And so it collects a tremendous number of facts and then throws them at you. So, but it's really great because they weren't able to figure out what's happening. Which is how I got to do it. But it's got an enormous amount of facts. Some of them are still classified. The report is redacted. I've read the redacted version in a minute. There's nothing with one or two paragraphs, there's nothing of real significance that's redacted. SISI had an agenda of blaming the intelligence community. They carried it out. That agenda well, but it means they didn't understand what was happening. Most of the internal reports have agendas as well. It makes it really quite hard. And this came home to me when I was doing the Iran one, and I was interviewing several of the analysts about what went wrong, which I found a fascinating intellectual question. And they were very sort of on edge and nervous. And I thought, why is that we're talking about this fascinating question? And I realized, wait a minute, I have tenure. They don't. They could get fired for what I'm going to say. So, there are all sorts of reasons these are written, and so it really is a problem. Okay, how did I come to do the Iraq one? I tell the full story in the book, but anyway, to make a long story short, I led a team of 3 other academics, and we all had the relevant clearances so we could see everything that was produced. And all 3 of us had done other work for the IC, and 2 of us were fairly well known in it, so we had a degree of trust in the people who we were dealing with. And we went in, we read the redacted parts of the report. We'd read the open one before. We read a set of documents, not everything, because we didn't have the time. We did significant interviews with people ranging from the term the NIOs, National Intelligence Officers. I don't want to say they're at the top of the food chain, that isn't quite right, but they were the ones who put together the broadest estimates. So they put together the national intelligence estimates, and in the Iraq case, this led to the famous NIE of October 2002 that everyone talks about. So we talked to people who did that, talked to the sort of mid-level people, and then we talked to the worker bees, that is the people sort of who left law school or other schools and went in and they're 2 years into their job, and they're the lowest level people, lowest level in the sense of not doing as good a job, but they're the ones doing all the work of producing the basic analysis. We talked to people, again, a little term, in DI, the Directorate of Intelligence. We talked to the people who collect the information, the Directorate of Operations, now known as DO, now NCS, National Clandestine Service. Why it was renamed is an interesting story, but anyway. But I do want to stress that we put in a total of maybe 10 days, not much more, so that I want to make two statements on this. I think I know more about the total picture of this case than anyone else. There are a lot of people who know more about specific parts than I do, the people in the government or a few, but they don't know, I think, as much as the whole. And there are enormous amounts of this I don't know, because there are so many people working on it. It has so many layers, so many moving parts. I'll talk about one or two puzzles, but there are a lot of things that I may be saying now that actually will turn out to be wrong. We may never know it. But to be immodest, there isn't anyone else, even the people who wrote the estimates, who know, as many of the pieces of the picture, but there are tremendous uncertainties. Okay, move on to politicization. I think the standard explanation in public opinion and much of elite opinion is they got the WMD assessment wrong because the IC gave into political pressures. The story is the Bush administration was set on going to war from a pretty early time. I believe that's correct. And that the pressure was transmitted through DCI Tenet down through all these people, and so you got the intelligence to please. This is wrong. I think I don't have proof, but I've got some pretty good smoking guns. Why is it believed? Well, it's an easy story, and it makes perfect sense. There are at least two basic reasons why it's believed. One is hindsight. We look at it now, and and if we had time, I could go through the pillars of evidence on the three basic forms of WMD: chemicals, biological weapons, nuclear. And we can see now how these pillars were made up of sand or some, that would be putting it politely. And so you look and say, how could they believe that? But as you know, that you can't do it that way. Have to say what was the evidence that was available or that was reasonable or could have been gathered, and what's reasonable on the basis of that. I'll come back to that. The other reason for this is that most of the people judging this case hate George Bush and Richard Cheney. Let me be the first to say, so do I. I want to get at the front of the line of the critics. But, there are a lot of things wrong. We have thunderstorms, my grandchildren misbehave, lots of things. There's litter on the street. Okay, Cheney and Bush are not responsible for every bad thing that's happened in the world. So let's put that aside. Tom Powers cannot put that aside. And so he comes out with, anyway. All right. How do I know? Know is too strong a word. I'll use it, but please understand that there are limits. Why am I convinced politicization is wrong? Well, I'm convinced, partly because when I started this, I really did think politicization was a bigger part of the story than it is. I'll come back to that. I think it plays a role, a subtle role, difficult to pin down, but not the major role. When I started, I thought it had a bigger role, partly because I shared the feelings about Bush, and partly I didn't understand how the intelligence community worked as well. But partly talking to people and reading the documents, and then beginning to think as a social scientist. And this is where the critics of politicization fail. And part of what I'm trying to do in my talk here and in the book is explain that applying good standard social science methods, right? I don't mean sort of multiple regression or even super fancy game theory models, but just good old, comparative method, hypothetico-deductive method, the simplest forms of social science method that have their problems. And if any of you constructivists, we could talk about that, and I've criticized standard methods in my systems book, but standards methods get you further than the critics went, and get you, had they been used right, further than the analysts got. What do I mean by that? Well, let me explain it by why I'm convinced that politicization is not the root of the problem. There were four major questions that intelligence had to address in the year or so before the war. One was, if Saddam got nuclear weapons, would things get much worse? Very important question. Intelligence is totally unsuited to answer that because they're not trained to think that way. This is what we do for a living in my department. We may be wrong, but we know how to go about that. They don't. It's outside of their realm. So they didn't address that question. And not because of political pressures, but because it's not what they're brought up to do. The second question was, what's the status of the WMD programs? They got that one wrong. But there are two other key questions they addressed. They got those right. And the answers they gave were not ones the administration wanted to hear. One question is, what's life going to be like after victory? The administration did not ask them to address that. The intelligence community and the NIO in charge here, Paul Pillar, political science PhD. Paul's book will be coming out, I think, in about a year. It would be very good. Anyway, I disagree with Paul on some of the things, but he's very, very good and was there. Anyway, they produced papers saying Reconstruction is going to be hard, very hard. And most importantly, are there links between Saddam and al-Qaeda or terrorism in general? Now it's harder and harder. When I teach, I often say something as you remember, and the class giggles because, of course, they remember, undergrads remember nothing aside from maybe 2 years ago. But I hope you remember that the administration pushed very hard on the connections between Saddam and al-Qaeda, and they asserted them in various ways. Intelligence examined this as carefully as it could, with the exception of the group set up in the Defense Department to produce the answer that the administration wanted. The rest of the intelligence community basically said, there's nothing there, boss. There are no connections. I can go into detail because obviously you've got to qualify them, but broad points. So on two of the three issues they addressed, they only produced the, quote, the right political answer on one. So if political pressures explain why they said there was WMD, how do we explain their negative answer on the two other questions? Now, there is a level at which you can answer. You can say, well, the NIO in charge of WMD was different from the NIO was working on the other two things. That's true. And I think the personal outlooks of the NIOs were not entirely irrelevant. So that's different from politicization. Another comparison. if we think politicization is important in the U.S., it's really as likely to be important in other countries. In fact, any of you who know the intelligence setups in other countries will think it's more important, because the American IC is much more independent than any IC that I know of in the world, including the British. All the others, the connections, politics, are much closer. So we'd expect, can't be sure, that if politicization is really important, you'd find the judgments of ICs around the world correlating with the political views. Not true. Almost every IC around the world came to a judgment quite similar to the American. I've just seen a reference, and I have to check with the author I'll see in 2 weeks, that the Canadian and Dutch arrived at a different conclusion. And there's one sort of small story where the Canadians came in. I don't know. I haven't read their documents. Maybe. But the point, the German and French ICs, the Arab ICs, okay. So it could be that they arrived at their conclusions one way and we arrived at ours another. That's possible, multiple sufficient causation. But it should make you skeptical. Third comparison is with the judgments in the Clinton era. There are differences between the judgments before Bush comes in and before 9/11 and the judgments made in 2002. But the differences are not enormous, and they track with incoming information. So we don't need politicization to explain it. Everyone got it wrong. And the areas, those other areas where they got it right, they didn't yield, other countries, I say I can't prove it, but the good comparative evidence indicates politicization was not the main cause. There is a particular puzzle, however, in which politicization does, I think, play a role. I cannot unravel the puzzle because I didn't read the classified material that covered this, and none of the other studies cover it. And I think we'll never know, because by the time the documents are open, it's going to be 30 years. People who wrote it will be dead or senile, and we're not going to, or their memories won't be any good, and you really can't tell from the documents alone. This is a puzzle that Powers does raise in his review, and he's right to raise it. Then he goes in wrong directions. If, as I'll argue in a couple of minutes, the incorrect judgment was reasonable in the fall of 2002, why wasn't it revised when the UN inspectors went back in November and then December and January? That is something we don't fully know, and I've just been corresponding email with Paul Pillar, who was there, and he can't pin it down completely. Part of it, well, let me just say there are a lot of parts to it. I believe part of it is politicization. I believe that what happens starting in the summer of 2002, but accelerating in the fall, is that everyone in the IC at this point knows that Bush is going to go to war. And they know in that sense the intelligence doesn't matter. And I believe this, I can't be sure of this, but I believe this induces, if you will, a form of passivity. And as the reports come in from UNMIVIC, they've all got problems and not seeing everything all there. But I believe, and I don't know this for, they're not sending up yellow flags and red flags. And I suspect, and again, no one knows for sure, that at least part of the reason is they know it's hopeless. And why do they want to endanger their careers? And at that point, I think, in a sense, politicization does come in. We don't have much evidence for that, and there are some other things, but I think that is true. And also, I should perhaps have said at the beginning, by the way, if you're trying to explain why Bush went to war, don't look at the intelligence. It's largely irrelevant. I mean, can't blame the bad intelligence can't blame the war. At least you can't blame Bush's desire to go to war on the bad intelligence. And I talk about the relating intelligence and policy in the book. So Let me not give that away, but that's sort of background. Okay. So it's not totally irrelevant because it comes in late. It also, I think, isn't totally irrelevant in that I suspect, but the counterfactual, I can't really prove, that if the political currents had been different, someone might have said at a certain point, let's step back and do a real zero-based scrub. That is, let's try to approach this de novo. Look at everything we have, ask hard questions, do what they call alternative analysis, bring in red teams. They might have. I don't think they would have. This is extraordinarily difficult to do. It's very time-consuming. It's disruptive. I can talk more about in question and answer why that is not normally done, but I will assert it is only done on occasion. It's been done more since this failure, and several, my team and others have urged that it be done more, but it's not common. So I don't think it would have been done under any conditions, but certainly the political atmosphere was the coffin nail in not being done. So, I'm not saying politicization is irrelevant, but it's not central. A couple of other things about politicization. Well, let me just mention that there are other things in there. We can talk about what politicization means. I do in the book. What's legitimate and what's illegitimate, because there are a lot of gray areas in here, more than analysts, I think, believe. Many cases are highly debatable. We can also talk about the legitimacy of decision makers overstating what intelligence say, which Bush and Cheney did all the time in the run-up, but that's very common. And we can talk about whether that is to be expected in a democracy. I believe that it is. We can talk about normatively whether it's acceptable. So there are a lot of topics in there, which I touch on. It's also related to what I talk about in the first half, the last chapter. I'm not going to get into here, that inherent tensions between decision makers who need certainty, who need psychological support, who need political support, and analysts who are very different creatures, who have very different outlooks on the world and different responsibilities in those tensions, and we could talk more on that. But I want to move on now to the third general topic. What is the basic explanation for the failure? The basic explanation is totally unacceptable politically and totally unacceptable to decision makers. The estimate was overstated, especially as we know that the key judgments, the summary in the October NIE dropped out the qualifiers. There are qualifiers in the text. They should have had them in the judgments. Not a major thing, but what the judge, when we look at the evidence that was available and the basic reasoning I want to talk about, that the fundamental judgment should have been wrong. That is, the fundamental judgment should have been, he quite probably has a stockpile of chemical weapons. Not certain, but 70%, 75%. Biological weapons, a little less certain, but there is quite a bit of evidence there. Nuclear, reconstituting the nuclear program, there's some things that are squirrely, but they're still significantly over 50%. That judgment's wrong, but that's the most reasonable judgment to be made from the evidence. Mainly what happened, and that was driven by specific bits of evidence that you can ask me about. It's in the book, things if you know the case. The aluminum tubes, the reports of curveball, various sorts of specific things. Not all the specifics have been declassified. There are a set of very small things that were very suspicious that are still not declassified. But it isn't so much that. We might have examined Canada and found all sorts of suspicious things that Canada was doing. It wouldn't lead us to invade Canada. And Canada has oil the same way that Iraq does. Well, why doesn't it? Because the background beliefs about Canada and Iraq are very good. The Canadian prime ministers don't usually torture their own people and use poison gas on their minorities, although if you've been in Canada, they're tempted to use it against Quebec, but they never have. So we don't expect bad behavior. And so with Saddam, you saw a hateful regime that had used WMD in the past, that had reason to acquire its bad neighborhood, that was paying an enormous price for not owning up. I mean, basic thing was they'd never complied with the UN resolutions. They'd never put out a full accounting. They'd never given the inspectors what was required to show whether they had weapons or not. And the country paid an enormous price for that. That, quote, proves Saddam had something to hide, right? Everyone believed that. That's very plausible. Now we have some sense of what Saddam was thinking, and I don't have time to go into it, but if I do a bit in the book, but if you read the marvelous study they're still more coming out, by Kevin Woods and his colleagues, you read the Delphi report of the Iraq Survey Group that went in later, and if you'd see what we now are pretty sure Saddam believed. There's a lot more coming out. We have 20,000 hours of Saddam's tapes. So any of you who know Iraqi Arabic want a research project, they're open for business. At least you got to get human subjects permission from your university, but then you can do research on them. If you put side by side the American or Anglo-American intelligence here and the Delphi and Woods report here, and use a little gizmo in Men in Black to erase your memory so you don't know what's happened, and I ask you, which of these stories is more likely? I bet you're going to get 10-1 on the intelligence rather than what we now believe. Just read it. It doesn't make sense. It makes a great movie, what we know as being true. Let me just give one minor example. The Iraqis never accounted for how they disposed of their chemical weapons. Well, why didn't they? The scientists told us. They did after the war, as they were supposed to. They dumped them. Okay, why didn't they tell us? They dumped a bunch of them right outside some of Saddam's palaces. Saddam didn't know this. He would not have been happy to be told it. So they couldn't tell us that. Now, come on, right? Great movie. But were you going to believe this? No, it's true. The truth was implausible. Say, this is politically unacceptable because, it excuses everyone. It's unacceptable if you're a decision maker because it forces you to realize that a lot of what you believe or some of what you believe about the world is wrong and it's not going to be corrected until it's too late. It's fine for us to say in the classroom, not fine when you're sitting behind a desk signing orders that can kill lots of people. It's just hard for people to accept that, but it is the fundamental truth behind this. Compounded by three factors. One, the belief that Iraq had a very heavy deception and denial program. There's good evidence for that. They said explicitly, we think we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. It's very plausible. They'd fooled us before the Gulf War. They'd fooled us, giving the inspectors the runaround. The problem with the belief is it's not disconfirmable. You say, why don't we see more stuff? It means they're hiding it better. What should the analysts have done? They should have said, there's every reason to believe he has an extensive deception and denial program, although they should have scrutinized that more. But anyway, they should have said, but boss, let me warn you, if we're not, our inference may be wrong. They said this is the tip of the iceberg. They never even asked themselves, what if it's the whole iceberg? Would we reach different conclusions if we didn't think there were D&D? They should have. Now, that's easy in hindsight. But, that was an error. They made other errors in what they call tradecraft. They did not use good standard social science methods. Go through it in the book. Let me just give you the one example, and the one that when we debriefed the analysts after we'd done our report, that they were most struck by. They didn't pay attention to negative evidence or dogs that don't bark in the night from the Sherlock Holmes Silver Blaze story. That is, if Saddam had an active WMD programs, there were certain things that one would expect to see, even if there were a big D&D program, and that we didn't see, and no one noticed. Now, saying that, I'll give you the example in a minute, doesn't mean you get the right answer. Don Rumsfeld is right. Absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence, but you want to note it. We set up, the U.S. government, probably the other governments as well, I'm sure other governments as well, programs to scour the world for both emigres and others who might even still be loyal to the regime, who would have had knowledge of the WMD programs, scientists, technicians, and we really went after them hard, and we got to talk to a lot of them. And we even sent Americans, Iraqi Americans, back into Iraq if they had relatives who were scientists or technicians to try to talk and see if they would learn anything. All of this turned up nothing. And no one noticed. Some of the negative reports weren't forwarded from the field. Some went to the field, to the so-called requirements officers or reporting officers who were the people in DO who took the reports from the field. And they were not forwarded to the analysts because some of them reached the analysts, but all the reaction was there's nothing to report. So why do we report anything? No, that makes sense. That's what we teach students not to do. This negative evidence wasn't dispositive, but it was highly relevant. If he had active programs, this real full court press would have been likely to turn up something. Now, it doesn't prove it. We couldn't talk to everyone. There are lots of ways of explaining this away, but it needed to be examined, and it wasn't. There were that one error, the other error was a big one related to plausibility. Analysts, I think, were strongly influenced by the plausibility. They didn't realize it. So they wrote reports as though the basis was all these, they wrote analysis as though they were only influenced by these bits and pieces they're getting. They shouldn't. They should have said, hey, boss, it's wildly implausible that he wouldn't have WMD. We see lots of these little things that support his having WMD, but you should realize those things aren't great. We don't have a smoking gun, and Bush, the last thing I said. So really, the main thing we're going on is not secret information, but common sense based on history and what we know. That would have been what they should have said. But they didn't, because they weren't aware of that. There's finally, I'm not going to talk about, but I have a little in there. There is an element of luck in individuals. There were 2 or 3 key individuals who, for various reasons, either one case an agent we had or that misled us, another case an American analyst working on the aluminum tubes, and had it been a different person in that position, we might have got it differently. So there is an interesting element of luck in personalities. Okay, I do want to now take the remaining 5 minutes to talk about a case that isn't in here. And because there's been so much discussion about it, and it's quite interesting. And this is the famous or infamous case of the NIE on Iranian nuclear programs released in November 2007. And I have to be a little careful here because some of this is still privileged. But the basic story isn't. Until the summer of 2007, spring or summer, we were convinced Iran was going all out on all aspects of the nuclear program. Then evidence came in of an undisclosed type will have been leaked that indicated that they had halted not the uranium enrichment, but the warhead design, fabrication, and fitting it into missiles. This was startling. The NIE was about finished in the spring, and then they got the new information, and they said, whoops. So they spent the summer and fall of 2007 getting this information, really scrubbing it, setting up red teams. And then the NIE was produced at the end of November, and it said there is a halt to these aspects of the program, and that this means that Iran is influenceable. It's not true that Iran is totally impervious to carrots and sticks. They're making consequential choices, hard to tell exactly why. They had an interpretation which I think was not supported by the evidence, maybe right, but anyway, basic story was that. I believe, and this, I'll say in a minute why it became public, but anyway, I think that story is essentially correct. Not entirely correct. There's some details that are not inconsequential, but they got the story basically correct. Even the Israelis now say they got it basically correct. How significant the halt is, you can argue. How close they are on other things, what the long pole in the tent is for the nuclear weapon. But, basically right. Well, what happens? This becomes public. Well, that's the first thing that happens. That shouldn't have happened. Not that it was leaked, but when I say it shouldn't have happened, because partly as a result of the Iraq fiasco, the intelligence community and the White House decided that NIEs that are secret should stay secret. What happens in the intelligence community stays in the intelligence community. A couple of weeks before the NIE was published, meaning released to the policymakers, the Director of National Intelligence said the key judgments would not be made public. The day the NIE was published, again, internally, the NIEs were public, the key judgments, the KJs, were released. They're available on the internet and worth reading if you're interested in this. What happened? Well, what happened, and I'm pretty sure of this because what happened was a real breakdown in communication between the IC and the White House, and a real failure of people at the top of the food chain in both areas, partly resulting from the Iraq case. And because of the charge of politicization, the people on the IC were a little more standoffish to the White House than normally would have been the case, because they didn't want to be open to the charge of being influenced politically. Partly also because this was a situation where they were constantly, in the summer and fall, they were still analyzing the data. They didn't want to go downtown with their conclusions because they weren't really sure of them. And because the degree of trust between the IC and the policymakers was so low, they felt they couldn't go into the guy's office and say, boss, this is where we think these is now, but we might come back next week and tell you something different. Policymakers are not happy if you're told that. They say, why are you wasting my time? Come back in a week. So, they didn't brief it as much ahead of time. So they write the key judgments following their orders. The orders are, this is an update on a previous estimate. So say what is new, say what's changed. And you're writing this at a very high level of classification. It's only going to people who followed Iranian nuclear stuff fairly carefully. You don't need to spell things out, everyone knows. So they write the key judgments, and you can say, call up on the internet, you'll see. They talk about the nuclear program. And then they have a footnote saying, by program, we're talking about this warhead stuff. We're not talking about enrichment, because everyone knows about enrichment. Well, that's great if you're a wonk, but for the New York Times, that's no good at all. Nuclear program, So they've halted the nuclear program. Well, the bulk of the nuclear program is enrichment, which they haven't halted. So the key judgments are read as totally undercutting the Bush policy. They're misread because the way they're written. And essentially, there are two aspects to that. One, I've said, they were written for insiders who knew the story and knew the footnote. And second, they were badly written. And key judgments are hard to write. You've got and any of you, I don't know if you have to write summaries in your papers. When I publish articles, I have to write abstracts. I hate them. I hate abstracts. They're passive voice, they're dull, they're compressed. And I never read, they're just no good. And doing them is a real art form. In the government, it's crucial because no one who matters is going to read anything longer than 2 pages, preferably with a diagram, too, to distract them. So they're important, but they're an art form. And the people who are writing the judgments don't like them any more than I like writing their abstracts. So they wrote them badly. And in fact, I told them they wrote them badly, but it was too late. And several of us told them they'd written them badly. Just they're awkward. They're not well constructed. So, but the main part of the story is they were written to be confidential, and then they're released. And they are, first releasing them was a bad security breach. When you read them, you can't tell anything from them. But if you're an Iranian counterintelligence official, you probably can. It's not a good way to run intelligence. But most politically, they're misread. So the Iraq WND had this real sequelae. All right, just 2 seconds on the general conclusions. Intelligence works very hard. Going from evidence to inference is treacherous. You're going to be wrong a lot of the time, especially, and this is the point my colleague Dick Betts has stressed, that was absolutely right, when the incorrect conclusion is highly plausible, it's very hard to get it right. And the wrong cases often are ones in which the truth is less plausible than what's believed. They're the exception to our generalizations. So that in a way, social science misleads us. We have some good generalizations, but when they're wrong, we're going to get the case wrong. Someone who doesn't know the generalizations may do better. But social science procedures help us. They don't get it always right. But in both the Iran case, the Iraq case, I think even the Iranian NIE and its judgment of why Iran was behaving as it was, I think if they'd been better social scientists, they would have done a better job. Wouldn't have gotten it right, but they would have gotten it better. Finally, just the quote I use in the book, but it's too good not to give, just on the difficulties between decision makers and social and intelligence. A quote from Lyndon Johnson. Let me tell you about these intelligence guys. When I was growing up in Texas, we had a cow named Bessie. I'd go out early and milk her. I'd get her in the stanchion, seat myself, and squeeze out a pail of fresh milk. One day I'd worked hard and gotten a full pail of milk, but I wasn't paying attention. And old Bessie swung her shit-smeared tail through the bucket of milk. Now, you know that's what these intelligence guys do. You work hard and you get a good program or policy going, and they swing a shit-smeared tail through it. That's often what they do. You can see why this is a difficult arrangement. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions if you have any questions of the author. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see if you could comment on a couple different hypotheses. One would be one that you alluded to at the beginning of your discussion, which is that not many people knew the full picture, and that the compartmentalization issue, if you think that ODNI has improved that at all, to tools like Intellipedia and things like that, if that's helpful, if you see that as solving that compartmentalization problem. And the second would be if relying on easy intel sources, either intel sources in other countries, which, as you said, are prone to politicization within their own countries, and also to Iraqi expatriates who had their own motives, things like that. If just being deceived by the easy intelligence on the human side was also a problem.
Yeah, second part first. No, the INC played very little role in the intelligence. Chalabi and, were trying to sell us a bill of goods. We really knew that. Some people say Curveball was an INC agent because his cousin related to Chalabi. I don't mean to give the stereotype, but in Iraq, everyone's related to everyone else. You can't be sure that's wrong, but nothing we know supports it, and a lot of things, like he's now flipping hamburgers in Germany, indicates that that's wrong. No, these guys were pretty good. They knew Chalabi was selling him a bill of goods. Counterpart services, it's unclear, or it's certainly still classified how much we were sharing both information and judgments. But Chirac is quoted by Hans Blix as saying, I don't believe he's WMD. My intelligence service tells me he does, but he has a great line. Those intelligence services, they intoxicate each other. It's a great line. I've talked to Blix about it, and he says, yeah, the Chirac really believed it. There's something to that. It can be a fundamental problem. Two things on your first question. Compartmentalization, I don't think was a major problem here. For most of the things, most of what we were learning was sensitive, but not super sensitive. The one thing that was reports we were getting from a high-level source within Iraq, I think a foreign minister, that came in late. That information was not shared with the analysts. I don't know what that information says. I could have, it was not that it was denied to our team, but we didn't have time. There's a set of reports that say what he said confirmed the judgments. There are other public reports that say what he said conflicted with it. People in the IC I've talked to said, who cares what he said? He was a foreign minister. He wouldn't have known anything. So there were some things that were compartmentalized. I don't think failure to share information was a problem here. It was in 9/11. Has the ODNI changed that? Yes and no. The ODNI, most of us believe, was a terrible mistake. I hope my friends in ODNI, who I work for, won't hear me say it. I think that's correct. I don't think we can reverse it, but I think it was a mistake. I think there were other ways to do it. I think there have been great improvements since 9/11 and since the WMD failure. I think the sharing of information within the community is better. And I think that part of it, both the technical things they're doing, I think there's a greater sense in at least some areas of operators and analysts working together. One problem in Iraq was they didn't communicate enough. In some areas now, I have to be vague, they're working together, not only in Afghanistan as known, but some areas they are working together much, much more closely. It makes a very great difference, although it has some problems. So I think there have been real successes. I think there's a backlash on compartmentalization because all the stress is on sharing. When you get a sensitive source, I think people may say now we've got to put it in a super sensitive compartment. In fact, there are more, if you will, super compartments than there used to be as a way of protecting against sharing. And they protect against sharing both because information is power and because, for good reasons, there are things that if they go out, you're either going to lose the source or people are going to get killed. So I think this question of sharing, it's always going to be a pendulum and it's very difficult judgments. But yeah, there have been changes. Yeah, in the back.
You mentioned that many times presidents and policymakers make their decisions not necessarily based on intelligence or on evidence, but based on either, say, just a gut feeling or advancing their own policies. But in the case of Iraq, there's little question that that led to undesirable results. Do you know of any president or any policy that was done in the same way but had positive results?
No, it's a very good question. First, I think your premise is exactly right. I think on the big issues, like invading Iraq or in the Cold War, stance toward the Soviet Union. Is it aggressive or can it be conciliated? Now, sort of, is it true on Iran? Hard to tell. A lot of things, gut instinct, general political predispositions, that is going to drive. You can nibble away at it at the edges. I think in the case of attitude toward China, both in the bad old days of the Cold War and more recently, people have come in with what one gut instinct had been and have been moved a little. Part of the problem with this issue, it's harder to study successes. I'm sure there are. Yeah, I'll give you one against my political views. You've got to tell Peter Fever I said this, that he's my Republican friend. No one say I don't have Republican friends. Anyway, that the Reagan people were convinced that the Soviet Union was fragile, that it was economically stretched to the limit. Intelligence was very skeptical about that. They were right. Now, a lot of policymakers thought that Gorbachev wasn't for real. They were wrong on that. But no, I think in a number of areas, if I would expect their gut instinct to be right. But the one I've given you, and I'm sure with I could dredge up a few more. I think they're quite significant, and that's why partly what they do is not, foolish. Yeah.
Okay. Your talk mentioned a number of generalizations or assumptions that seem to have been left unexamined during this process. Are there any thoughts that you have on perhaps decision support tools or checklists or procedures that would help them examine or help the panelists examine these or at least get them out in the open?
Yeah, well, it's very good because that's part of what I'm doing now on some other issues is trying to read current intelligence and say, let's do a pre-mortem and figure out, there are two things, three, one is sort of doing it almost intuitively, which is now what I'm doing in a number of things. Just to come, read the estimate and try to step back and say, now wait a minute, let me think of alternatives, let me dig deeper in the sense of what does this really depend on? Are there some beliefs, some assumptions you're not telling me, not because you want to hide it from me, but because you don't understand? Let me tell you, it's a hell of a lot easier as a postmortem. So some of us are, work on doing this, if you will, intuitively. A second level, there have been proposals which I think are good, but as far as I know, have not gotten far, to do checklists. I've worked with some psychologists, including Danny Kahneman, who many of you know of, who's a Nobel Prize winner for developing being a co-developer of prospect theory and other things. And Danny's worked on checklists in a number of areas, and I think that that's a good idea. And then third, there are a whole bunch of structured, and they call it structured tools, and there's a new book out by Richard Hoyer and his co-author, whose name I've forgotten. I blurbed the book, but I've forgotten the co-author. I don't know as I know Dick. And I blurbed the book, but I'm a little skeptical. But again, my approach is, if in a sense, it's still good social science, but it's, I don't know. I may be too much a child of the 60s and do my graduate work at Berkeley to find structured tools really acceptable or really comfortable with them. But they are useful, at least in pushing you to be Bayesians in a non-simple way, at least to say, what evidence would disturb my views? What evidence would distinguish between propositions, that sort of stuff, which is very important. Analysts I've talked to, again, ambivalent. It's partly, I think, personality type. I certainly would like to see experiments with them, and I'm working with a group about trying to run experiments. So, and the IC is quite alert to this. And there are differences of opinion, I think, going just by how people do analysis. But I think certainly the, if you will, softer structure, methods are definitely should be used more. And I'd really like to see them take a run at the, more structured tools and see if they work. We don't know, but there's certainly reason to try them.
I think we're probably out of time, unfortunately. We'll have a book signing right after, and maybe you'll have another opportunity to interact with the author. Thanks again.